Hello, this is the sermon for St Christopher's Church in Leicester for Sunday, July the 5th, 2020. The passages for today are Psalm 57 and Matthew 17, verses 1 to 13. So if you've not yet read those passages, please pause this video, read them, and then press play. Perhaps you've heard of these two reactions to danger: fight or flight. Fight is when people go at the danger and fight against it. Flight is where people run from it. Perhaps we know people who get aggressive when they themselves are faced with aggression, and others who will do absolutely everything they can to avoid conflict. Fight or flight. Maybe you recognise one of these two to some extent in your own natural character. I know I do. But I want to talk to you about another approach to danger which is completely different to both of these. Imagine this situation. There's a person who's gone on safari, and for a quick moment this person thinks it's safe to get out of the van and have a closer look at some wildlife. So they walk some distance away from the van until the van is a dot in the background. And then they hear a growl. And they turn around and see a fully grown lion staring at them, slowly moving towards them as if to pounce at any second. What does the person do? Fight or flight? Well, how about neither? Just imagine that in that moment the person, whilst face to face with the lion, suddenly pulls out a musical instrument from their backpack and starts worshipping God. Maybe that sounds crazy to you, but that's kind of what David is doing in this psalm. In the face of danger, David worships. How? Well, because David knows something that frees him up to worship, even in the face of danger. And that's what we're going to think about today as we look at Psalm 57. But first, I'm going to give a little bit of info about what's going on in David's life at this time. You see, in the introduction to this psalm, even before verse 1, we are told that David wrote it when he fled from Saul into the cave. You see, Saul, the first king of Israel, is trying to kill David. You can read about this episode of David's life in the book of 1 Samuel. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we read that David is anointed to be the new king of Israel, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. And Saul is rejected as Israel's king, and the Spirit of the Lord leaves him. And in the chapters which follow, we see how Saul becomes hostile to David and attempts to kill him. As a result, David flees from Saul, and at one point he ends up hiding in a cave. Now, even though Saul has been rejected by God as king, at that time he was still operating as king. And so he had the soldiers, he had the armies, he had the military forces which he used to hunt David down. And so that's the situation in which this psalm is written. And with that background in mind, the first thing I want us to note is that danger and worship belong together. Facing difficult times should not stop us from worshipping. For that, just look at verses 4 and 5. In verse 4, David describes the men sent by Saul to kill him as dangerous wild beasts. I am in the midst of lions. I lie amongst ravenous beasts. And then immediately after, in verse 5, he worships. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. You see, David doesn't worship because he's pretending the danger isn't real. He doesn't put his fingers in his ears and go la 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 and pretend it's not there. No, there really are men looking to kill him. Their swords are real and they are sharp. Their spears and arrows are the real deal as well. There are some religions that are about trying to detach yourself from the world, trying to pull yourself away from it so that the stuff that happens around you can be kind of pushed away. If the world around you is violent, seek to escape it. Buddhism is an example of this approach. But Christianity recognizes the hardships of this world and is real about them. The Bible is so clear that danger, disaster, sickness, and most of all sin are things that harm us and mar our existence on this earth. And of course, with the continued threat of coronavirus, we see it every day in the news, and indeed in our own city during this Leicester lockdown. So how is David able to worship? Well, David tells us his reason in verse 10. For great is your love reaching to the heavens, your faithfulness reaches to the skies. David is hiding in a cave because there are men seeking his life. But he still knows who God is. God is the same God who anointed him king. The same God who sent his Spirit upon him. The same God who enabled him, a young shepherd boy, to defeat a giant Philistine soldier called Goliath in single combat. Nothing he was facing now changed all of that. It didn't change who God was or who God had shown himself to be. David knew God still loved him and remained faithful to him even in the danger. He knew who God was and what he was like through what he had been taught, and he knew who God was and what he was like through what he had experienced. And so because of that, David is confident that God will intervene to help him, and that when he does, it will reveal his love and faithfulness once more. Look at verse 3. He sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends his love and his faithfulness. Now notice here that David uses the same words in verse 3 as he does in verse 10, love and faithfulness. He worships in the cave because he knows God is a God of love and faithfulness. In verse 10, he shows that he has a steady knowledge of God's love and faithfulness, an ongoing sense that that is what God is like. And from that, he's confident that God will show his love and faithfulness through intervening in David's current situation. Verse 3, God sends his love and his faithfulness. Those aspects of God's character will be seen as he actively intervenes in David's life. David is confident that how God rescues him will be in complete harmony with what David knows of God already. And so David worships, even when facing the ravenous beasts. In fact, look at his eagerness to do so. In verse 8, he's talking about worshipping even at daybreak. Awake, my soul, awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. It doesn't seem to cross David's mind, does it, that the reason he's having a hard time is because God has changed and no longer cares about him. No, God hasn't changed. And so David waits for his rescue, which means once again seeing God's love and faithfulness in action. Turning to our other passage, the transfiguration of Jesus in Matthew 17. Think about the experience of Peter, James and John, who witnessed it. On that mountain, they see Jesus gloriously transformed. Verse 2, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And verse 5, a bright cloud enveloped them, a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." On that mountain, those 3 disciples saw and experienced Jesus' glory in a way they hadn't seen before. But then, it was over, and Jesus' appearance returned to normal. But as they walked back down that mountain with Jesus afterwards, surely they looked at him differently. They had seen the bright, blazing glory of the Son of God, and even if they didn't continue to see it, they knew. And even when he was arrested, beaten and crucified, it was still the same Jesus who they'd seen transfigured on that mountain that day. No mob or army or earthly government could possibly take down this Son of God unless he was allowing it to happen. And no matter what they went through as his followers, they had seen his glory and they would see it again. Who God has revealed himself to be is who he is now, no matter what is happening to us or around us. But it's possible for us to slip into doubting this, isn't it? At a previous church, there was a guy I would sometimes meet up with to read the Bible and pray. And sadly, he was a person who was prone to doubting God's love for him if something difficult was happening to him in his life. And I remember explaining to him that if we base whether God cares about us or not on what is happening to us in the moment, then our faith will be very wobbly. But if we focus on Jesus' love, on how he went to the cross for us, then our faith will be on solid ground. Because Jesus' death shows his love for us, and it's something we can point to which will never change. If we simply think, well, my life is easy at the moment, therefore God must love me, or my life is hard at the minute, therefore God must not care for me. If we think like that, then we'll be thrown about by life. But it's not just the guy I met up with. I'm vulnerable to wondering about God when things aren't easy. But if I remind myself that God is the same God who sent Jesus to the cross for me, if I remind myself that he is the same God who I have seen move powerfully in my life down the years, if I remind myself that he is the same God who right now provides for me every day in innumerable ways, even during lockdown, then I will see that my future holds more of the same. I will see his love and faithfulness at work in my life in the future, whatever exactly that looks like. And where we've failed to understand this, and as a result acted in the wrong way, there is forgiveness if we repent. Remember, Peter, James and John saw the transfiguration. But later, when Jesus was arrested, they deserted him. Peter even denying him multiple times. If there is grace available for them, then there is grace available for us as well. So, when we, like David, find ourselves in the cave, facing difficulties or danger, we need to draw upon what we know about God and what we've experienced of him in order to reassure ourselves of who he still is. So let what you know of God lead you to worship. Let what you have experienced of God lead you to praise. Because if we are continuing to trust Jesus, then what we receive from God in the future will be more of the same. More love and more faithfulness. Yes, in this life, but to the greatest measure in the next. Maybe take a moment to think about what you've heard and then to pray.